Tonight, but I'm going to pass it over to Crystal, and then I'll close out with the end. So thank you very much for being here.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to our first Exceptional Parents meeting of the year. It's great to see new, old faces. We have a wonderful presentation today, wonderful and small, but first I would like to introduce our new parent coordinator, the Crown Official. Give us some notes. She's going to give us some announcements, and then we'll go on with our presentation.
Thank you. Well, real quickly, I'm just learning, so there'll be a learning curve a bit here. So I'm talking right now. Let's see. First of all, everybody saw the parent membership, and we have a basket if you missed it out there for that. So
can you talk a little louder?
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Our
Put yourself on mute.
Just quickly, our donations go towards setting up our meeting, the video and audio taping that we do. Our employees during this are paid, our student employees are paid. And also every year we like to give back a gift to the school or the studio. And so just recently we gave our animation studio a Wacom board, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yes.
A Wacom tablet.
Wacom tablet. So they can draw right onto a tablet, it goes right on the screen, very cool. And our wonderful teachers, we gave them a refrigerator.
So that's where that goes. And we also are starting something new this year, and it's called the Room Parents. So there's 3 classes, so if you think you'd like to volunteer for your child's classroom to be a room parent, it doesn't involve very much. It's not like when they were in grade school and you planned the parties and stuff. But maybe take the collection for a holiday gift for the teachers. And most important is the wish list. And they've had a wish list for a long time, but it doesn't get, the items don't get met very well. And so everybody, if you could, take a wish list flyer out there on the table before you leave and start, maybe bringing something, having your kids bring something, or, look at some of the different items and see what anybody could possibly bring. I mean, if somebody has something like, I don't know, if you have a printer paper that you bought too much of, like us, because we always bring, buy.
Or if you're going on your trip to Costco, we just take our wish list along and throw it in the
Right, yeah. It's so easy, easy things to get that we always get too much of, and we have our cupboards full of giant rolls of toilet paper, so you can probably, share them with us. So that's a big thing, and pretty much, I think that was actually it. Oh, and the volunteer sign-up. We're doing something a little bit different than what we originally planned when we did the volunteer sign-up. Whoever signs up for the snack, they're going to actually bring the snack, and they're going to pay for the snack. And so we thought, well, if we're going to ask for dues, it seems silly to then give you the money back to pay for the snack. And I bought the snack this time, and it didn't cost anything, and it was super easy, and just ran into Trader Joe's and got a couple of things and brought it here and set it up on the table. George set it up for us today, and it looks great. We'd like you to come a little bit early before everybody gets here to do the chairs, and then right whoever does the cleanup, we put it all back. So that's about it, and thank you for coming, everybody. And I hope I can figure out what to do for this new position.
Actually is our very first speaker from our very first parent group with speakers situation, if anybody remembers, about 3 years ago. Yeah, Mark was our first speaker 3 years ago, so we're coming around the corner. We're all smarter, wiser, older, everything. So I'm very happy and pleased to present Mark Small.
Well, it's always tricky to give a talk to the parent group who's been through it all. At this point, if you are here at Exceptional Minds, you have successfully navigated pretty much early childhood challenges. You've been able to get services in place. and your kids are now at that place where they're trying to get a job. So I will find when we present to groups such as yourself, often there's a sharing of information. I may learn a few things. Perhaps I can teach you a few things, or maybe have you look at the law in a way that you haven't before. And we might have some successful thoughts that come out of tonight's talk. I've had the pleasure of coming to be part of the programming here at Exceptional Minds in a couple of different ways. As Kristen referenced, first, as a parent support, and also in my capacity with Autism Speaks when Exceptional Minds received one of the first community grants. I understood that at that time, this was one of the first ones of a $25,000 seed grant. And so it's pretty exciting that they've taken all of the parent interest, the impetus, and they've really launched into the stratosphere. So, a little bit about myself. If you don't know me, we tend to get out there and get around. I also have a special guide of my own. If you've heard me speak before, you know about Andrew's story. My son Andrew is 16, and he's a child with, I think we would call him severely autistic. He appears to be intact inside, but he's still finding his words. And so it's a daily journey with him. It's been my wife Eva and I's privilege and honor to be his parents, and we continue to be excited about all the wonderful things that he's going to accomplish. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work in the community with the UCLA CART, teaching law to second and third year students at USC as a professor adjunct, teaching specifically in the realm of disability rights, and participated in the SEEP project, which is our special education advocacy project through COPA, which is our national organization, training advocates in special education rights and responsibilities. The SEEP project now is a national project, and it's administered through the web and also in the offices of attorneys all over the country. So as a result, we're hoping to bring that advocate core up to a level of professionalism that hopefully the parents deserve and expect. So something really exciting for us, 2 years ago we co-founded the Sparrow Project, which is our own effort at training for young adults with disabilities. In the Temecula wine country, we have a demonstration vineyard for young adults 16 through 25, and we're teaching growing grapes, making wine, hospitality, computer skills. It goes on and on. But we also were a recipient of a $25,000 community grant, and we've been launching in...
Is that okay?
Sure, it's okay for me.
It'll be easier for them to see it on the screen.
How about you folks on the web? Can you still see us?
Can you hear and see on the web?
It's a little better with the lights off, but the voice is kind of like it's going through a tube.
Okay, can you talk a little louder and see if that helps?
I'll try, sure. Okay, so with that, I wanted to go ahead and launch into the presentation. Now, before we get started though, I wanted to get a sense for who's in the room. When you talk about transitioning from high school to adult services, you understand we have the range of folks. There's some of you who've already made the transition. There's some of you who are getting ready to think about transitioning and that kind of thing. So what I'm going to try to do as we speak is to tailor as best I can. And then I'm hoping at the end we can maybe set aside maybe the last 20 minutes for some brainstorming and come up with some ideas. If you're interested, if you have particular questions, or if there's a way maybe I can lend some of my experience to your particular question, it may benefit all of us. How many of us in the room today still have a high schooler? And this would be someone still enrolled in high school programming. Okay? Excellent. How about, well then that would mean the rest of you are out of high school, right? How many of you had your students graduate with a high school diploma? Okay, good lot. And how many have aged out through age 22 and then they've left the programming at that point? Okay, so none. So for the folks that are working with kids in high school, how many of them are not yet 16? Okay, a couple. So what we're going to talk about is sort of a vision for transition planning and how we can look at this whole process differently. As you may be aware, transition planning is, especially after IDA 2004, was to be a coordinated set of activities that resulted in the young adult receiving the necessary training to be launched into their career. How many of you maybe who've left the system already, maybe left high school without a whole lot of preparation for getting a job and independent living and that kind of thing? Oh, quite a few, yeah. How many of you are just being polite? The first time. You don't have to tell me because the statistics already speak. Our national studies currently tell us that kids with an IEP are less likely to receive a high school diploma. They drop out of high school twice as often as their non-disabled peers. They enroll in and complete post-secondary education programs at half the rate of their non-disabled peers. And they're currently employed at a rate of 1/3 of the rate of their non-disabled peers. And even at that 1/3 rate, very few of them have full-time employment. And so as a result, what we realize is that our society, despite those efforts, is churning out a series of young adults who aren't quite ready to be earning and not quite ready to be paying their taxes and essentially supporting the system that they, in many cases, so desperately rely upon. And I think that that's our challenge, right? We have to help our kids to find their niche. They all have something wonderful to contribute. We just have to figure out what that is. And then hopefully with that, we'll have our success. Next one. So when we talk about transition, understand that there's a series of things to consider. Obviously, the procedural safeguards that are associated with transition, the actual transition planning itself, and the recognition that school districts have to allocate the resources for all the children served. And I think that a lot of these slides apply to the regional center system. Now, as you know, the regional center system these days is moving towards alternative methods of funding. Currently, the mandate of the Landerman Act is maximization of future potential. And when we look at the notion of maximization, the question is, how can we use the law as it exists now to maximize those opportunities for future? And how does that different maybe than self-determination, which might be an administered sum of money but may not be up to the same standards as what the legislature intended when they first innovated the Landerman Act? One thing I want you to keep in mind when we talk about today's presentation, and this applies equally for school districts and regional centers, compliance is the driving force. Whether it's the IEP document that's being measured by hopefully objectively measurable goals and objectives, or whether it's the IPP, the individualized program plan, that talks about outcomes that are devised to be tailored to the individual, taking into account preferences, family dynamic, things that work for you, and also the all-important inclusive element to regional center programming. You have to think, how do I take that program and how do I memorialize it in the document to give this legal contract the strength that it was intended to have? Next one, please. So one thing I want you to keep in mind for you families that are still working through the school system, when you talk about the regional center versus school district duties, and we're talking about those kids that haven't yet graduated from school, you're talking about the school district providing services and supports necessary to access education. Regional center, which is going to be the principal actor in your child's life from 0 to 3 and after graduation and beyond, they have a different mandate altogether, which is access to the community, right?
Mark, can I ask you to try this for a second?
Sure.
See if that makes a difference.
Sure.
Maybe, can you stand on this side?
Now I'm tethered. All right, is this any better, folks on the web? Does it still feel like it's in a tunnel? Does everyone in the room think I'm in a tunnel now?
Yeah, it's still like in a tube, but in a tunnel, but I've just found an audio option where you can call in from the phone, so I'm going to try that.
Okay, all right. What does this mean, that we don't want to use this as a team? All right. No takers? Come on, guys, you got to work with me here. This is Sunday afternoon, I'm half asleep.
Mark, are your slides available for us, or do we?
I'll send them to anyone who wants them.
Okay.
And I have a sign-up sheet over there. If you'd like, I'll send them to you. And I anticipate you're going to have questions. So if you have specific questions about some of the cases I'm referencing and things like that, I'll send you those too. So just bear with me. It gets a little crazy on Monday, but we'll work together to get that info. So with your regional center, when you think about accessing regional center services, for those of you in the school setting, and those of you who've now left, you may remember that the regional center sort of went quiet during the school years, especially in recent times with the elimination of candidate services and voc the recreational components essentially being removed from the IPP process. Regional centers haven't been very active for the folks in school. And
you should keep going. I'm going to try and, Okay, we're good.
All right, fantastic. I'm just grateful that they're running the tech and not me. All right, so, and of course, the school districts during that same period, they were taking the lead on things like related services, right? So it's the speech, the OT, social skills, that kind of thing. And then there's this strange transition planning, and it needs to be in place at age 16. And it's supposed to be based on an outcome-oriented paradigm, which means we're not just supposed to put it in the IEP, we're supposed to actively be moving towards meaningful transition to adulthood. We'll be talking more about that, but frankly, the state of transition that we see in high schools these days is largely a set of pre-designed services that they try to find the best way to fit the child into. You know, things like, I want to go to college. Okay, so part of your training is going to be to explore colleges. And what does that mean? It means going on the internet and looking at college application requirements and maybe filling out a faux application. And yes, that's helpful, and I agree it's maybe part of what you could work on during a single week's activities, but I doubt it's the entire year's goal, which is to simply look at information on the web. So you'll see us actively advocating in our school cases for a really meaty, robust transition program that is geared on a year-by-year acquisition basis, with the goal being there's going to be this seamless handoff at graduation where hopefully the agencies that exist after the Regional Center, Department of Rehab, these agencies come to bear and help us fund programs like this, like Sparrow and beyond. So let's go to the next one then. So the school district's responsibility, and this is basically age 3 through 22 or graduation, whichever occurs first. In special education, we refer to graduation as a terminating event. Pretty negative sounding, but essentially it means the termination of special education eligibility. So for you folks that have children who are still in the system, you need to be cognizant of the fact that when your child takes a diploma, and that is takes a diploma having earned it on the general education requirements, their rights to special education resources and supports terminate, which means that's great, we've achieved what we were after, but have you lined up the necessary post-secondary transition supports so that you're not confronting what many of our young people confront, which is months on the couch trying to find that right program. If you'd be willing to share, did any of you experience that drop-off that once high school ended, there was not sufficient resources for the next step?
Zero.
Zero, nothing there. Okay, so a couple of you raised your hands, a couple of you had this look on your face like you weren't happy about that period of your life. And it's true, right? I mean, because ultimately you're, at the same time that this happens, and by the way, the Regional Center, this happens at age 3 at the transition too. Right at an operative time, when you're moving from one slave services to the next, you change service coordinators, right? Usually, the 0 to 3 is early intervention. They hand you off to the school unit, right? And that's right at the same time you're supposed to be starting your IEP-related regional center supports. And the same thing happens at graduation. You get handed off to this adult unit. And apparently, the adult unit is the one that's supposed to be coordinating the supports and services for independent adult living. And so right at the time that you need that continuity of support, you have to build an open relationship. Often our service coordinators happen to have a few cases on their caseload, may not be swift about calling back. And then so starts this potential for months of missed opportunity. The goal is, of course, to come up with a paradigm that adjusts for this and gets ahead of it. And of course, using compliance as the driving force to make sure that it occurs. All right, so one thing I want to talk about now is the regional center, and I want you to start thinking about the regional center in a slightly different light. How many before today have heard of this notion of payer of last resort? Okay, that's not enough, okay? You need to know it's the single, in my opinion, one of the single most powerful components of the Lanham Act. And what it says is, and the regional center will portray it slightly differently, what the payer of last resort requirements are is as follows. The regional center is to explore and exhaust generic service provision for needs that your child has. That would mean, if a school district, we're going to call that a generic provider. We're going to call your health insurance a generic provider, often for things like ABA and behavioral. And maybe we'll look at IHSS for things like respite support and that kind of thing. And the regional center will tell you, we would like to provide these services, however, the generic service provider has to be explored and exhausted first. There's a provision in 4659 sub C that says, that is the duty of the regional center, to explore the generic providers first before paying for service. But the sub C says, however, nothing in this statute, and this I'm paraphrasing, shall be interpreted to confer costs and expenses onto the family while those services are required. And that means that the payer of last resort definition is truly like a safety net. And it operates at the very lowest level, so that if the parent has tried to access supports and services, and they have not been successful, or they've not been able to get these other agencies to help provide, the regional center is to continue to provide that service to avoid costs and expenses shifting onto the family. Most people either don't know about payer of last resort, or when they ask for assistance under that provision are told that it doesn't necessarily apply, or that it requires a certain series of steps for the parents to go through before help can be arrived. And as a result, the parent is now funding at a pretty excessive rate the costs for the program. So if you haven't looked that up, you need to look it up. It's not exactly clear in the statute. You have to read all the way through and pay special attention to the C subpart. After graduation, or age 22, this is when the regional center is stepping in and providing active services in case management. The case that really is the defining one in California is the ARC versus the DDS at the bottom there. Of course, they've changed the name of the agency because it's no longer appropriate or polite to refer to folks as retarded. Of course, we know this. So this is as late as 1985. The very advocacy organizations in our community were using terms that we no longer endorse. But one thing I want you to pay special attention to is that in that case, these 5 components were broken out and have become the definition of what the DDS, Department of Developmental Services, is to be providing for your young person. A person with developmental disabilities has the same rights as any other Californian, which means that by virtue of their disability, they cannot be denied access or participation in a program that would otherwise be available to a non-disabled peer. They have the right to make choices in their own life, which means if you're, for instance, looking at pursuing a program like vocational training in film development, like we do here at Exceptional Minds, this is an important factor, and the California Supreme Court signed it in on this point. Rights to choose and family preference, these are essential. They have the right to receive information, and I put it in quotes there, understandable, to help them make the decisions. This doesn't mean that the parents have the right to receive the information in a manner understandable to you. It means that the information with respect to accessing supports and services have to be delivered to your young person in a manner that is understandable. How many of you have had some communications with the regional center that you found less than understandable? How many of you were aware that there is case law that says that the regional center may not rely on a fixed policy to deny a service? Never heard of that one, right? This is binding, valid law. How many have been told that the regional center can't fund Exceptional Minds because they have a policy against funding under the manner you requested? Kind of relevant, right? Wouldn't that be exactly relevant to your question? Because if they're telling you that that's their policy, and if the case law says they can't rely on policy to deny, you probably would want to have that case. You might also like to give it back to them in writing. If I understand correctly, you're relying on the regional center's policy, and in this case, this is denying access to the program, and this is, of course, illegal. And you can give it to them. Bless you. Okay. Now, you have the right to receive services and supports under the least restrictive conditions to help maximize potential. And this is what I was talking about earlier about the standard of law applicable to Lanterman Act cases. Maximization of future potential in the LRE. Now, least restrictive environment, we remember this from our special education days. It means that you have the right, or your child has the right, to be educated alongside their typical peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Also, they have the right to access vocational training, let's say in this instance, that meets their preferences, and also can be done in a manner that ultimately leads to inclusive opportunities like employment in a general education, real world type of scenario. And so if you've identified a program that meets all of the 5 components that we've talked about, this is what the California Supreme Court says is your right. Now, how many of you it's fair to say, I think we were talking a moment before we started with one of the board members about the number of folks that receive Exceptional Minds help from the regional center. About 60%, is that a rough figure? Mm-hmm. About approximately. And then the other 40%, I think, are ultimately probably funding through own means, right? Or maybe through parent reimbursement of some
just to be clear, I think we don't receive anything. Those folks that do get, that 60% that do get, have fought their regional centers to get whatever support they've got, and then they pay us and they get reimbursed.
Sure.
And some people are out of state or not part of the
through under different mechanisms. Now, just for purposes of the recording today, a lot of what we're talking about has to do with Land Grant Act, and that's applicable only in California. This is a California state-specific statute. But I'm sure in your local jurisdictions there are probably alternate agencies and statutory schemes that help provide these services. Now, there are reasons, I'm sure, why the organization doesn't vendor with the regional center. I can guess them really quickly. Number one is probably the requirements are onerous, which is you have to do X, Y, and Z to be a vendor of ours. Probably next, they probably don't pay what it takes to actually conduct this work. And so as a result, that's probably why it exists like that. And so the organizations that ultimately are founded and deliver services with efficacy obviously can't always run under these strict paradigms. Now I know, and I have direct information of a series of students that I've become aware of that have also services through their school districts that ultimately give them access to a place like Exceptional Minds. And that is under the traditional notions of transition planning. If you've got a program in place that's devised around your child's unique needs and the services provided by the school district are cookie cutter or form-fitting to that program and not specific to the child, therein may lie an option for seeking reimbursement through the school district for cost advance. The only problem with this all is that all of these scenarios involve parents paying first or receiving some form of scholarship or grant and then ultimately trying to get that back after the fact, which is very tricky, obviously very expensive. And so I think we all have to put our heads together eventually to come up with an alternative on that. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure we could eventually get to some solutions. Okay, so. All right, so let's talk a little bit about when transition planning should begin. And I want to emphasize the point. Under the state and federal law for special education, this is the second paragraph, the IEP team decides when transition planning begins prior to age 16. After IDA 2004, which is our last version of the federal special education law, the age was moved up from 14 to 16. And at that time, that actually is among the most confusing of adjustments in the statute, because if anything, information would tell us that we should start earlier with transition, not later. But what Congress ultimately decided was we would move transition age to 16, but we would give the transition supports and services the additional requirement that they would be outcome-oriented and measurable, so that instead of just going through the paces, they're now held to a higher standard. However, the statute does allow the IEP team to come together and make a determination of starting transition planning earlier, which means that you're not bound to start at 16. You can start earlier if you feel it's necessary for your child. These references here, the ones that are called Letter 2, these are federal special education policy letters that are written by the Department of Education to clarify these questions for parents. And you can find them under the OSEP designations that I've given here for the references. And then OSEP is the acronym for the Office of Special Education Programs. This I think is key, and for those who are still moving through the process as a school-age student, keep in mind that this is something you should be asking for and putting into your IEP as soon as it's realistic. And again, especially if you have a vision of where you want your child to be in the next few years, you need to put that in play. I would suggest also that we need to be thinking about transition more than a 2-year activity ahead of graduation. We ought to be thinking about it like a 7-year plan, which is ahead of that age 16 and into the transition to adulthood and beyond. If you do it and think about it that way, you'll have the opportunity to make sure that the necessary members of the team are at the table and helping to make the decision. Okay, so just a little bit more about graduation. Generally, the school district's decision to graduate a student is an IEP team decision. It's not automatic, which means that you very much have a seat at the table as the parent, and your opinion about whether the child's ready to graduate it should be considered and documented. Long-standing case law has held that graduation is a change in placement, which then triggers the IDA's procedural safeguards. How many of you had the benefit of a comprehensive reevaluation ahead of your child's graduation? A lot of our California districts are not comprehensively assessing children and ahead of graduation. And why is that a problem? If a program is looking to receive the child directly after graduation, but it's unknown where their present levels are, it's what are we looking at now in terms of parent delegation, right? Potentially expensive assessment in multiple domains. And a reasonable program, I think, would be in a position to say, do you have any updated documentation that might be able to inform us about your child's strengths and weaknesses? The other thing I want you to be aware of is that once your child leaves the school system and perhaps starts looking at placement in a community college or a California State University or beyond, they no longer have the protections of the IDEA. The IDEA is a statute that only governs school-age services, which means that for purposes of college-level participation, they change in terms of the statute that protects them. Now they're covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. There are other statutes, of course, but Section 504 is the most common one. The other thing that's important is the 504 protections are not automatic, which means if your child wishes to have the protections of a 504, they have to themselves advocate for those protections. They have to self-identify as being a person with disabilities, and then work with disabled student services in order to have the necessary help with their teachers, extended time on tests, accommodations, let's say in assignments, that kind of thing. How many of you were aware that your child leaving school with an IEP would have the potential of tuition and books covered through the California Community College system, no cost to the family? Okay. So we have an article over there on Department of Rehabilitation Rights, which is, it's quite possible that if your child had an IEP at the time of exiting, some costs for participation in college could be paid by the Department of Rehab. How many of you have active Department of Rehabilitation help in your lives? Very few. Okay. I would think all of you should have a Department of Rehab counselor and someone actively working on the program, if for nothing else, to provide the advocacy support in terms of helping you with the regional center, and also to make sure that you're exploring and exhausting those generic providers, right? You can go to the regional center and say, we've gone to rehab, this is my child's vocational focus here at Exceptional Minds or another place, and we've explored and exhausted the provisions there. Can you help us through the regional center? Next one, please.
Does DOR start at age 16 or 18?
The Department of Rehabilitation is supposed to be involved in the transition planning for transition at 16. I believe they hand off at 18. Okay, so what we're talking about now is goal writing. And I want you to keep in mind that goal writing has to do with both IEPs and IPPs. And I guess I'm taking the position today that IPP documents tend to be sort of free-flowing, rather non-committal at times. General expressions of what we hope to happen, but not really necessarily something that calls for real measurable progress and growth. And what I would suggest is that the IPP should be governed by the same kinds of proficiencies that your IEP documents were. If you're still, of course, in the program with your child's high school or before, I would suggest that every goal needs to have clear components to it, including the following. Present levels of performance, and this is where your child is now, where the student is now. And I would say you need to describe in detail the present performance. That is, we want to make sure that our goals are geared towards movement to the next level. In the school systems, the annual goals have to be devised around 1 year of progress. I would say with Regional Center, it's been my experience that the goals change in form and that they become, again, something we're getting to, or working towards, but in terms of when the performance is due on those goals, it's a looser standard. And I would suggest that we need to make it a stronger one and more objectively measured. With respect to the third component, the goals need to be objectively measured. Otherwise, how will you be in a position to ask for additional help for your young person? If the question is, well, we made progress towards that IPP goal, but we didn't quite get there, what would that be then for you folks as an opportunity? A chance to say perhaps the program and service that's been allocated under the IPP isn't tailored to the person's unique needs. And maybe the argument now rises for an adjustment or a change in how it is they receive their instruction. Again, when you link that together with things like parent preference and the consumer's preference under the law, now we can start to say, this wasn't working, it wasn't tailored to my unique needs, and I need this. And then that would inform our requests to our service coordinator. I think you need to start with the following kinds of fundamental inquiries. Number one is, what are the person's unique needs? If you have unique needs in your family, and for your son or daughter or an individual you're helping through this process, I would suggest that if there is a need that exists, you need to have a goal for it. And that means that it's insufficient, for instance, if we're drafting an IPP, we maybe have 2 to 3 to 4 outcomes, when in fact maybe the range of needs are extensive and we need to be planning for all of those needs. I think you need to insist on provider data. There's a bad habit that's evolved in our local regional centers vendor relationships. How many of you have experienced this where the vendor submits the progress reports directly to the service coordinator and not to the family? That's a common problem, right? Because you, as the decision maker or support person for that young person, are being denied the information and it's going directly to the service coordinator. And how is it that if the program is geared around the individual person requesting help around their unique preferences and needs, why would the information on updates flow directly to the service coordinator and perhaps never make it back to the parents or the consumer themselves? This is something that is unheard of in special education, but again, it's a byproduct of that relaxed sort of ongoing reporting that often happens in the regional center. I think you need to insist on the provider data, and I think it should be a standing outcome in your IPP that the consumer and the consumer's family be kept in the loop on all provider updates, and it should be specifically written in as communication. If it's not provided to you after you've written it specifically into the IPP, do you think that might be valuable for a judge looking at your case down the road to say that the parents and the consumer weren't kept in the loop, were not updated on their progress, and therefore we're denying the participation that this process is supposed to enshrine? Know that your young person is going to need support and service in a particular realm. Wouldn't it be helpful if you came in and had your own requests? For instance, what if you knew that you wanted to access Exceptional Minds Studio, and you know that maybe you could look at 3 or 4 planks of this program and draft goals that are specifically tailored around acquiring access to X program for supported movie production. You may create a goal that's of your own preference and devised around a need that compels funding for this program. So the agency will then look at you and say, well, we don't have any vendors who can provide this. So then you say, well, how about a parent reimbursement model, and we can go ahead and do it that way. Or what if we would look at perhaps developing some other mechanism for funding other than shifting it onto the parent while we try to find that necessary support. Okay, these are the areas that I think we need to be focusing on and keeping our eye on the ball. These are taken from the federal education law, but I think that we can apply them equally well to the Lanterman Act when it comes to ongoing support for your young person. What are the mechanisms for post-secondary education? This is the training and vocational side of your child's program. That is, what is your end goal? What are you trying to achieve for them? I mean, part of it is probably you want them to have a job. You'd like them to receive some form of compensation for their time, and hopefully we'd like to make that employment gainful. And we need to have a vision for what that is in your IEP program. So for your children 16 and above, be cautious about exploring their program. Let's start to talk about what are the necessary pre-steps towards access. Independent living, daily living. I assume some of you folks have some young people that are living on their own at this point with support. We can talk a little bit more about that. I'd like to open that up in the question and answer in terms of just getting a sense for how it is that your children are currently living. But this is something that should be planned as early as that 16th birthday, and we should be talking about what are the nuts and bolts of keeping one's home in order, managing the payments and the expenses associated with being there, managing things like basic household chores, repair, maintenance, calling the necessary parties to help with those things. These are things that a lot of our young people simply don't have the skills yet acquired to achieve. I think they certainly could acquire them, and they just have to be systematically taught these things. What about life skills, community participation, things like awareness of their health needs? And I'm not just talking about taking one's medicine out on time. I'm talking about, I don't feel quite right. I may need to call the doctor. Or, I'm falling in love with this person, but I don't necessarily know how to express that I love them without maybe having the authorities called on me. Something like that. Mine's 16, and I'm so worried about that. I gotta tell you, I get a lot of calls. From a lot of parents saying, "Oh my goodness,